So on to the other effects that the coronavirus is having on the fantasy baseball world. We've already seen so many players sidelined by the COVID diagnosis. You have Aroldis Chapman, Mike Moustakas, Juan Soto got sidelined literally the day of opening night. Then you have Austin Meadows. You have Puig, who's not signed, but he's not signed because he has COVID. He got signed by the Braves, and then they said, you know what, you have COVID, never mind.
It's insane. Like, it is a mess. It's a mess, and I feel so bad for the sport of baseball and friends of mine like you guys that are so dedicated to the sport. It's just.
But my question is for you guys. While I know that I am a commissioner of a couple fantasy baseball leagues, and I know that you guys play in at least one or two fantasy baseball leagues, maybe you're not the commissioner. As a fantasy baseball player, are there any adjustments that you want to see made to either the rules for your fantasy league or, some of the settings, whether it's expanded playoffs or expanding the IL spots so that you can move players around or more moves allowed per week? What are some moves that you want to see your commissioners make? I mean, obviously, you can't make too many adjustments after your drafts have already happened because your drafts are basically based on what your league settings are. Your drafts are going to be different from a head-to-head setting to a roto setting. They're going to be completely different from one to the other. So without changing the entire scoring of your league, what are some changes that a commissioner like me can make for your league to kind of navigate this COVID pandemic in baseball?
I said, hey, why not switch to roto for just this year? We're playing, 6 weeks, and then we go into playoffs or something like that?
Yeah, it's so hard to even pick playoff teams because we only have, if you have a 12 or 14 team league, and let's say that you do head to head instead of roto, you only have 6 weeks to determine who those 6 or 4 playoff teams are going to be.
I mean, I feel like that opens the door for so many different, tie scenarios and things like that because you think about it, if your regular season is 6 weeks, a normal season, that's the middle of May.
Yeah, and let's say that you're in a head-to-head categories league where you're, playing between 10 or 15 categories. One bad week could sink your entire season.
Like, how does your strategy change now? Because a lot of people, they'll punt saves or they'll punt batting average or something like that. That strategy takes on a whole different head now.
I'm in a league with Christian, and he did open up the IL spots, but I just put all the people that are on the injured list onto the injured list, and I had to use all 7 of my weekly waiver picks because I needed to fill out my roster, and I still didn't effectively do it. I mean, I'm just gluing things together with putty and just hoping something works. I feel like my team's made of rubber bands and popsicle sticks right now. But you have the same issues that you have in every baseball season, which is some people start off slow. Some people start off hot. So you without getting any consistency, like you said, with the playoff issue, you're kind of blind. You could have technically the worst team in your league advance into the playoffs because they hit their stride at the right time.
They got hot for 2 weeks.
For 2 weeks. And that's just crazy because part of the benefit to baseball drafts or baseball fantasy teams is that you could have one guy that's killing it for 6 weeks and then he falls off, but right when he falls off,
someone else picks
guy
it up.
lights. Yeah, so and you can sometimes predict that with just how teams are playing, who's hot, who's not. And this year, I just feel like there are so many moving parts. I pictured this fantasy baseball season like that's like the staircase in Harry Potter, where it's just moving all over the place, and you actually have no idea which door you're gonna go in, what stair you're walking up. Like it's a absolute clusterfuck, and I really, really can't wait for things to just go back to normal. End of rant.
It's just crazy how everything is set up to be so fluky this season. How is that going to impact 2021 drafts?
So the hit rule that we just mentioned. Think about what if you were a guy that scored 5 runs or 10 runs, and again in a shortened season. So you're putting these numbers side by side with real or what you think is real, but it looks like that person has 18 runs scored or whatever, or losses for pitchers. That we had just mentioned. I feel like that affects things so much. Like for the next year, you don't have real numbers.
So some of the settings that I adjusted for this crazy 2020 season that we're going to have for fantasy baseball is I moved up the allotted amount of IL spots as high as it can go. In Yahoo, I believe it's 5. And in other leagues, you can go up to, I think there's some hosting sites that let you have unlimited. But as high as it can go, that's where your settings should be because you don't know how many players are going to come down with this virus throughout the course of a season.
I can't believe I complained last year because I did have some injury troubles last year in fantasy baseball, especially down the stretch. And I remember complaining to Christian, he's the commissioner of the league, that I needed that we should open it up to more IL spots. And now, oh my god!
Yeah, last year I believe we had 3. This year with Yahoo allowing us to have 5, I moved it up to 5. The second thing is that I'm in another league that is extremely limited on the amount of moves that you can make per week. We're only allowed 3 moves per week. And I have been, even in healthy regular seasons, I have been campaigning for us to have more than 3 moves a week because I'm a guy that likes to stream my pitchers. And I understand that limiting the amount of moves you can make is designed to eliminate the people that stream pitchers and get all of their points in points leagues off streaming pitcher after pitcher after pitcher. So they have limits there so that you can only stream so many guys. But when you're limited to the point where you're allowed 3 moves per week, and there's going to be weeks where we have more than 3 guys on our rosters getting COVID.
So to play devil's advocate, not that I agree. I do not agree with that. By the way, I think you should open it up. Have as many IL spots as you need. However, to play devil's advocate, could it be said that it's a level playing field because everyone has only 3 moves?
Yeah, essentially every time that I've brought this up, that's what the commissioner and the rest of the league has told me. Like, well, everyone gets 3 moves. I'm like, well, yeah.
When everybody has
that's
a team
fair.
that's not playing, it's not fun.
So it's going to be a complete crapshoot of luck of which team gets diagnosed, which team is hardest hit by COVID when it matters the most.
Do you guys think next year, like a stat that we keep track of is going to be like their immune systems or like how like their antibodies and shit? Like,
do they have COVID antibodies? Yes or no?
It's going to play into like people's like rankings. Like CMC's pretty good, but he did get a cold in December, so he's fallen out of my top 5.
An NFL player has the COVID antibodies, so we just move them up our rankings. So
yeah, I know Philip Lindsay's splitting carries, but it is confirmed through sources close to him that he has the antibodies. So he is now the number 1 running back available.
So the first move that commissioners should make is expand your IL spots to as many as possible. The second move is if you have a very limited amount of moves per week, you should move that up to at least 7. I believe 7 should be the minimum amount of moves per week that a fantasy team should have this fantasy baseball season. That way, you can address the regular injuries that are going to happen over the course of the season. We've seen a couple of those already in baseball. We've seen Kluber, we've seen Verlander, we've seen those guys go out. And you can also kind of prepare for the players that are going to be sidelined for a little bit with the pandemic. So you have added IL spots, you have added allowance for roster moves that you can make per week. And the third move that every fantasy baseball commissioner should be making right now, if they are in a non-roto league, if it's a league that goes head-to-head and you're going to have a head-to-head playoff matchup, you should expand the amount of teams that are allowed into your playoffs.
Right. I believe in ours we just are on the cusp of expanding to 8 teams instead of 6. So you could have a guy that you have an expectation to kind of carry you through the regular season or vice versa, or have a guy that is going to show up late in towards October or whatever, and then you get it's just a jumble. I think this is going to be the most interesting fantasy baseball season ever, with it being rushed and kind of slapped together. And at this point, correct me if I'm wrong, not promised.
But then the counterpoint to that, I feel like if you want to expand the playoffs in fantasy baseball, does that cut the season even shorter now? Like, how do you deal with that?
Well, the way that I was looking at it is I was trying to have as many regular season games to determine our playoff teams as possible. And in order to expand the regular season from 6 weeks to 7, I would have had to cut the playoff teams from 6 to 4 in a head-to-head matchup. So instead of expanding it from instead of limiting the playoffs to 4 teams, gaining 1 extra regular season week, I'm thinking about going the other direction. If it's my preference, it was my idea. I put it up to a vote in my league. I'm letting them vote on it to approve it because I don't want to throw the hammer down as commissioner. I put it up to a vote where instead of allowing 6, we allow 8. And this is a 14-man league. So the way I see it is we have head-to-head category 1-win settings. Whoever wins that week gets 1 win. The way I'm looking at it, after only 6 weeks, do you know how many teams are going to be bunched up between 4 and 10 in the standings? You're probably talking about the majority of your league is going to be within 1 game of each other at the end of the season.
So hear me out.
Terrifying.
What if we go to the opposite end of the spectrum? And this is only something that I thought about right now, so it doesn't matter at all. And I'm not a commissioner of any baseball league, so it really doesn't matter. But like I said, the opposite end of the spectrum, we go old time MLB playoff structure.
With
only
2 teams.
2 teams.
If that was an option,
I'm not opposed.
I would heavily consider doing that, where I would go 8 teams or 8 weeks of a regular season. The top 2 make the championship in week 9. Call it a day. I would be all for that, and I don't believe Yahoo has that setting where I can do that.
Well, that's because Yahoo sucks.
I think the minimum
Make it up ourselves.
I think the minimum amount would have been 4 teams in the playoffs, one week per round, and that allows us 7 regular season weeks, 2 playoff weeks, and then you crown your champion. So what I did is I'm heavily considering, and I think the vote is actually winning, to expand it to 8 teams. That way, more than half your league gets in. And this idea was inspired by Major League Baseball expanding their playoffs. They expanded from the 10 that's regularly allowed to 16. Which,
Jesus.
I really hope that this rule and this change does not carry over into 2021, because I think a lot of the settings and a lot of the rules that they're implementing for 2020 are test runs to consider going forward. Like, I would bet money that the DH is coming to the National League after 2020, and they're using 2020 as a test run, but I would bet a lot that in 2021 the National League is still going to have the DH for so many reasons, to expand players' careers, because they want there to be more runs scored. There's so many reasons to have the DH in the National League, and I think that this is their excuse to try it. But I hope that they don't take that same mindset into these playoffs and say, well, more markets were in it, we're getting more money, let's let everybody in and call it the NBA.
You know what? This is a rule that I'm not a fan of being long term. For just this season, I think it makes sense because we're playing in such an abbreviated season. Like we discussed, there's going to be so many fluky performances. I wouldn't be surprised if 2 months from now, the best starting pitcher in baseball has a sub 1.00 ERA, or we have a 400 hitter or something like that.
Yeah, we'll see guys bat 400. We'll see guys with ERAs that are close to the record. I don't know what the season ERA record is.
Yeah, like, what do we do with records that are set based on average? Like,
Those have to have an asterisk
you
next to it.
have to.